أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره وإليه نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everyone. So, Jazakallah khair to Brother Ammar for the introduction. But I would say probably the most important part of my bio to me personally is a part that wasn't included, which is as a mother to 3 children. My children are older now. I have my oldest is in her last year of graduate school. I've got my middle son who's in his last year of college, and the baby is wrapping up her high school years. So my children are older, but I think, as parents being here in this gathering, in this seminar, seeking out knowledge, seeking out, words of advice. I think all of us have been there, all of us have been through that journey, because we know that our children are an amana. They're a trust from Allah Azza wa Jal. And as any amana that we are entrusted with, our children are both a blessing and also a test in that blessing. So today I really want to take some time to just journey with you in terms of better understanding the stages of Tarbiyyah. Because when I look around this room, I'm thinking there are probably different ages of children. How many of you have children in the first stage of Tarbiyyah, from age 0 to 7? Okay, so there's definitely a couple there. How many have children in the second stage of Tarbiyyah, from age 8 to 14? Okay, and how many of you have children in the last stage of Tarbiyyah, from 15 to 21? Alright, we've got all the numbers represented here, mashallah. Children older than 21? That's me. So there's a few in there as well. Okay. So alhamdulillah, we see that we've got different ages and stages here, and as we go through the stages of Tarbiyyah, I think it's important for us to recognize and remember that it's never too late. A lot of times we'll do these workshops and programs, and people will tell me, well, my child is now 17. How can I go back in time and do things right in stage 1 or stage 2? We can't go back in time, of course, but we can learn from gaining a better understanding of what to expect in those stages and how to respond to it, and then bring those into conversation with our children, even if they've moved past those stages. So listen now, when we talk about that first stage of Tarbiyyah, age 0 to 7, we know that the process of Tarbiyyah begins before the child even leaves the womb. We often think about day 1 of Tarbiyyah, of raising our children, as the day that our children are born into this earth. But when we look to the Quran, we see the example of the mother of Maryam alayhi salam. And we see that she made the initial dua, the initial intention of Tarbiyyah, before she gave birth to her daughter. And we see in the Quran, we're reminded that she makes that initial dua when the child is in her womb, dedicating the child in her womb to the service of Allah. And so that is her intention before the child is even born. And we know that when Maryam alayhi salam is born, we know that the response that her mother has is a continuation of that intention. That she calls out to Allah, recognizing that she has given birth, and that she has given birth to the female, and the female is not like the male. And we start with this statement because I cannot tell you how many times in our counseling centers we see youth, teenagers, preteens, tweens saying, my parents treat my brothers differently than they treat me, for the female. Where the female might say, my parents always say, girls are not like boys, boys are not like girls. And so many times when we speak to parents, they will go back to this verse in the Quran and they will say, in the Quran it says that the male is not like the female. And yet what we're seeing today within our communities among our youth is serious issues with gender. And I know you're all aware of what is happening, the conversations around gender nonconformity, gender non-binary approaches, and we see our Muslim youth struggling, not necessarily with gender dysphoria, but with the social construction that aligns with social gender dysphoria. And many times it's rooted in what they hear from a young age. So when we go back to the intentionality of the mother of Maryam alayhi salam and those verses in the Quran, we see that the follow-up to the recollection or the understanding that the male is not like the female is that Allah Azza wa Jal accepts Maryam onto His service. And so we recognize that the mother of Maryam alayhi salam in this moment gives birth to her child, has made the intention to dedicate her child to the service of Allah, recognizes the social constructs which at that time females were not dedicated to the service of Allah. Females were not raised in learning the monotheistic religion and understanding the religious philosophies of the time. And yet she continued with her intention. And Allah Azza wa Jalla accepts Maryam onto His service. And we know that Maryam alayhi salam was then raised in the mihrab, the highest, most honorable area of the temple, to learn the monotheistic faith. So as parents, our takeaway from this first lesson in the Quran is that we begin to raise our children before they are even born. It begins with who we are. What is my connection with Allah? What is my spiritual angle? How do I want to live my life in this dunya? How do I view my children? Do I view them as a trust, as an amana from Allah that I will be asked about? Or do I view them as a possession, something that I own? Do we recognize the limits that we have as parents? And do we set our intentions from before the birth of our children? Because that's where Tarbiyyah begins. So inshallah, hopefully, we start out with that intentionality. And it's an intentionality that we don't just make when our children are in our womb, but it's an intentionality that we need to make every day. Every day that we wake up with our children. On the days that it's like, 5 a.m. before Fajr has even come in and we've got maybe our little ones tugging on us, wanting their cereal right away. On the days when the babies have had explosive poops in their diapers and we're like, we just want a few more minutes to sleep. On the days when our teenagers are particularly challenging. On the days when our young adults are going through their own struggles and maybe bringing them home. Every day renewing our intention. Renewing our intention and recognizing that we are raising these children for the sake of Allah. That we are raising these children not because of what they can give to us, but the benefit of having the beauty and the joy and the blessing of the children and the benefit of having the test and the struggle and the difficulty also in raising the children. And recognizing that with each of those days, with each of those steps through the tarbiyyah of our children, we are raising them for the sake of Allah. We know, of course, the example of the Prophet Nuh, alayhi salam, who called and called and called to his child to come to the straight path, to believe in La ilaha illallah, and his child refused. And it is again a reiteration of the understanding that we have no ownership over our children, that we are simply there to guide them, to teach them, to get them to understand what it means to love Allah, what it means to live lives that are purposeful in pleasing Allah. But ultimately, al-hidayah min 'inda Allah. Allah Azza wa Jalla is the one that brings hidayah into the hearts of our children. So, number one, intentionality. Number two, dua. Making a great deal of dua. Because when we see children who maybe are carrying themselves in a way that's pleasing to Allah, who are strong in terms of their deen, maybe strong academically, strong in terms of family, this is the result of the dua and the protection of Allah. And when we see children who maybe are struggling, who have maybe fallen in their deen, who maybe are not moving on the right path, this too is not something we should point the finger and blame the parents for, but recognize that Allahu yahdi man yasha. And it's our job to ask ourselves every night and to hold ourselves accountable every night as parents and ask, did I do the best that I could do today as a parent? Did I please Allah in how I parented? And that hopefully is the goal that we'll get from the seminar, inshallah, asking ourselves and understanding how best to please Allah in the way that we parent, and how we as parents can take on the responsibility of our role without taking on that sense that the accomplishments of our children, that the path our children follows is necessarily a direct result of our actions. The direct result of our actions is to please Allah. In that pathway, inshallah, Allah will protect our children and keep them on the straight path. So what happens in those early stages, age 0 to 7? This is the age of security. When we look at the stages of Tarbiyyah, we see that first stage, 0 to 7, being the age of security. The second stage, age 8 to 14, being the age of discipline. And that last stage, from 15 to 21, being the age of advisement. Why in that first stage do we call it the age of security? And we see from the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam that his process of tarbiyyah, particularly in the example of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam's relationship with Fatima radiallahu anha, we see that his process of tarbiyyah followed these three stages as well. So in that first stage, in the age of security, we know that when we see little ones, like this little adorable Jannah, is that her name? Jannah, inshallah. So Jannah, since we've come in, has been walking around, right, holding up her little doll, right, and every time she passes someone, I see like the eyes light up, and everyone's like, oh, and they're like waving at her. Because at this age, in those early stages, there is a sense of rahmah that exists in our heart. When we look at our children, and we look at the children of others, and we feel a softness towards them. And this is the age where we know that they will be receiving that love, whether from their parents, their grandparents, from those around them, with the awes and the cuteness of how they act. Now imagine if it wasn't Jannah who was walking back and forth here. Imagine if it was a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, someone who was in the second stage of Tarbiyyah. Would we be smiling and being like, aww? Probably not, right? We would probably be shouting at the child or saying, get out of the way or don't be in there anymore, right? Because that age of security, 0 to 7, there is an understanding that the child is learning. Yet when they move into that second stage of Tarbiyyah, we tend to lose a little bit of that understanding. And we tend to go to a place where there's an expectation that behavioral norms will be followed. But we need to make sure that in that first stage of security, we cement that sense of connection with our children so that as they journey to the next stage, when we are putting up those bumpers or those borders in terms of discipline, they are ready to receive them because they know that they are coming from a place of love and not a place of anger. So many times as parents, we parent our children from a place of anger or a place of fear. And this is where we as parents need to stop and ask ourselves, what did I experience as a child? What was my mom like? What was my dad like? What am I going to carry into the process of tarbiyyah with my own children? And I know for all of us as parents, we've all been there, where we've had that moment where maybe we're like, giving our kids like the stink eye, we're giving them the look, or we're like, saying something to them, and we stop and we're like, I sound exactly like my mom, or oh my goodness, I sound exactly like my father. And so even though in our own childhoods, we may have had moments where we said, I'm never going to be like my mom, I'm never going to be like my dad, we need to recognize the replication of our behaviors and the importance of understanding the generational cycles that often occur in terms of parenting. If we are not conscious in terms of what we may have experienced in our own childhood, what may have harmed us, what may have caused trauma, if we are not conscious and ready and willing to work through that, we will carry that trauma into our own families. And it's a cycle that will continue until someone is able to stop it and break it. And this is why we see the cycle of domestic violence often recurring. Someone who grew up in a home where domestic abuse was prevalent is likely to either enter into a marital relationship where they are either the abuser or the abused, and they are likely to continue that cycle with their own children. So again, we talk about parenting as starting with us, with our own journeys and our own understanding of our experiences and what we've been through. There's no shame in seeking counseling. There's nothing haram in trying to work through your own difficulties. And if you've come to the table of parenting carrying your own heavy baggage, unpack that baggage. Unpack that baggage for the sake of Allah and for the sake of protecting your children from going through harm that you may have been through. So we go back to that stage of security and the importance of cementing the love. Many times when we're working in our offices with marriage couples that are going through difficulty, we identify some difficulty in communication that's linked to attachment theory. And some of you may be familiar with attachment theory, but in practical terms, it looks a little like this. One person maybe there's an argument over where to go for dinner that night. and somehow the argument escalates between husband and wife. And one person says, I don't want to talk about this anymore. And the other person says, no, we have to talk about this. Let's figure it out. You can't go to sleep angry, right? And then the other person might shut down and just not talk for the next 3, 4, 5 days. And then the other spouse might get very agitated by this, right? Sending mad texts and angrily speaking consistently, maybe muttering things under their breath. What we see in this couple dynamic is a difference in terms of attachment. And many times our attachment styles develop in that first stage, age 0 to 7. So if someone has an avoidant attachment style, meaning they don't want to address conflict, they shut down if conflict is brought to them, they need more space to process, it is likely that the first caregiver that they attach to may have maybe been a little bit aloof, may have not answered the child's cries. Just, in recent years, we're starting to see correlations between verberizing, the method where you let the child cry it out, and avoidant attachment styles later on in life. Because the child who cries and calls out and the cry is ignored will learn how to self-soothe, which years ago was considered a positive attribute, because if you can self-soothe, then you can deal with any problem. But what we see happening today is that in couple relationships in which there was more of this hands-off attachment with the primary caregiver, we see that in the couple's relationships, the response tends to be more avoidant because the person doesn't want the comfort or the soothing from the spouse. They are self-soothing because they're used to not having someone respond to their cry. Now, subhanAllah, interestingly enough, we often see those who have avoidant attachment style marrying those who have anxious attachment style. And it's something about the opposites attracting. The person who has anxious attachment style is the person who will text 20 times a day, who will say, why are you leaving? Why are you late at work? Why don't you want to talk to me? Why don't you tell me what's wrong? What is going on? And many times, again, this anxious attachment style develops in those first years, 0 to 7. The child who cries and is immediately responded to, often will develop anxious attachment because they are used to having that need met right away. So our deen is so beautiful when we're reminded that khairul umur al-wasat, that everything in the middle path is what's best, right? So even in raising our children in that age of security, we want to find that middle path. Right? We want to be able to show our children that we are there for them, that we are their source of comfort and their source that they can turn to in that stage, because it will carry them in those later stages. But we also want to give them enough space to develop, to be able to learn coping mechanisms that will help them later on. But it's a balance, it's finding the middle road. So how do we do that? How do we give them enough security that they can feel heard and seen and comforted while also not giving in to every beck and call? So it starts with how we communicate. There was a time when my kids were younger that, my youngest was in kindergarten, my son was in middle school, and my daughter was in high school. And I remember, when I would pick them up from school, I would pick up the kindergartner first, and I would say, I wouldn't even get the words out, how was your day? And she'd hop in the car and she would be like, she'd be like, Mama, can I tell you what happened today? Oh my goodness, I dropped the crayon and Amina picked up the crayon and Amina put the crayon in her nose and I said, that's disgusting. And at that age, in that early stage of development, it's so tempting to tune our kids out. It's so tempting to focus on the road, to maybe finish sending the text if we're home, to focus on maybe what we're doing in the house or the work that we're doing on the laptop. But that is the stage when our children are trying to understand how they relate to us and how we relate to them. And so in that moment, the most important response that I can give is a question of interest. Being able to tell my child in that moment, what color was the crayon? And why did she put it up her nose? And how did you feel when she put it up her nose? Because in that moment, that crayon being up her friend's nose is the most important thing to her. And if I don't show my child in that first stage of tarbiyyah that what is important to her is important to me, then when she hits those teenage years and those young adult years, that is when our children shut us out because we weren't necessarily listening in those early years. So listening attentively, listening to understand, and listening to respond in line with what the child is talking about, not listening to respond with something that we're thinking about. So a lot of times the response in that moment might be like, okay, I have to drive, right? And there we are responding to what is most prevalent to us, right? Rather than responding to what's most prevalent to the child. Now, as I would drive and I would head to the middle school area and I'd pick up my son, and he was around, I guess, 13 or 14 at that point, and he would come in the car, and normally, I would want to ask the same question, how was your day at school? But again, I wouldn't even get the sentence out, and he'd be like, fine. And I want to be like, okay, well, how was the math? That's fine, right? And barely, even if I got a grunt sometimes, it would be good. And so I realized that as my children were moving up older, that day at school was not what was most important to him. So I spent hours sitting with my husband, learning all about the Knicks and the Jets and, being able to figure out the differences in baseball from basketball, because I knew that was what was important to my son. So when my son would come in the car and I'd say, can you believe those Knicks? Or, oh my gosh, the Jets coach really has to get fired. That's our current conversation. So as soon as I would start the conversation with that, suddenly there was a response. Like, yeah, whoever it was did really bad or whatnot. Because it wasn't about the math test to him. It wasn't about his day at school. And so when we listen in those early stages to understand what's most important to our children, as they grow older, we're able to carry that lens of importance in our conversation with them. Then I'd head to the high school and I'd pick up my oldest daughter, who was in that last stage of Tarbiyyah. And again, I would want to start out with that same question of how was your day at school? And that is the stage where if any of you have, I think she was about 16 around that age, if any of you have, female teens around that age, in high school, there's a lot of emotion, just like a depth of emotion that's very intense, right? And I would pick her up and I would just about to say, how was your day? And I'd see like the tears welling up in her eyes and there was some new drama, right? And she would always say to me, I can't tell you now, because of course her siblings would be in the car at that point. So we started to develop something called 5-minute time, where each child would get 5 minutes every night, 5 minutes with me and 5 minutes with their father. And during those 5 minutes, we would have no devices, right? We actually purchased an egg timer so that we could set it for 5 minutes. And during those 5 minutes, they could say anything they wanted. And they knew that we wouldn't lecture, we wouldn't respond negatively, we wouldn't even give advice in those 5 minutes, that we would carry the conversation the next day if there was something that needed to be responded to. And so in every room, I'd spend 5 minutes in my daughter's room, my husband would be in the younger one's room, and vice versa. The younger one would spend her 5 minutes like wanting to sing a song or tell a story, and that was important to her, right? The oldest one would want to unpack the drama of the day. And then eventually my husband and I realized we have to have 5-minute time too, because otherwise you lose sight of the connection between the husband and wife. But that 5-minute time became such an important staple in our children's lives because it was dedicated time just for them. And 5 minutes, it seems so small, but so many times when we're running around in our days and we've got work and we've got family and we've got so many things that we're navigating through, it's hard to find those 5 minutes of dedicated time to really allow our children to be seen and to be heard. Because that's what happens. When we're running around focusing on everything else in the world, our children feel like they're not seen. They feel like they're not heard. And this is why we see this rise in the use of social media, the need for likes, the need for this affirmation from the online world among our tweens and our teens, because so many times there's a feeling of I'm not seen, I'm not heard within my own home, within my own family. So focusing on that sense of seeing and hearing. And again, we see the example of Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. When Fatima radiallahu anha would enter into a room, if Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was sitting, he would stand and ask her to sit in his place. And this is during the first stage of Tarbiyyah, when she was just a child. We see that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in his mercy towards children, even with Hassan and Hussein, with his grandchildren, he would carry them on each arm and consistently kiss them, showing them physical affirmation, showing them physical love and touch during that time when it wasn't even considered the norm, of course, to have that type of relationship with a child. So making sure in this first stage that we are there, that we are present, that we are connecting with our children. Making sure also that we recognize the influence that we have in that stage. Because that is the stage, age 0 to 7, that our daughters will often, put on a hijab and say, I want to be like mama. That our sons maybe will, walk around with like a briefcase and say, I want to be like mama. That our daughters may be typing on a laptop saying, I want to be like mama. That our sons may be hopefully entering into the kitchen and doing chores and saying they want to be like baba. Because this is the stage where our children will emulate us. And there's an exercise that I like to do with parents that helps us better understand this. So if you all stand up for just a minute. Okay. We'll stretch our legs a little bit every 15, 20 minutes. Okay, so I want you all to raise up your right hand. Now I want you to put that hand on your head. Now I want you to take that hand and put it on your knee. Now I want you to put that hand on your shoulder. Now I want you to put that hand on your chin. Okay. How many of you put it on your chin? How many of you put it on your cheek? I saw a lot of cheeks. I did. Okay, you guys can sit down. Okay. Why, those of you who put your hand on your cheek, did you hear me say chin? You heard me. So why did you put it on your cheek if I said chin? You were looking at me, right? You emulated what you saw. We are visual creatures. Now take us as adults and our visual response and multiply that by 10 to better understand the way a child responds to stimuli. Because in that first stage, 0 to 7, the greatest response to stimuli from children comes from the stimuli of 7. So we may tell our children, don't fight with your sibling, don't raise your voice to your little brother. But if our children are growing up in a household where mom and dad are yelling at each other, are raising their voice against each other, that's what they're going to emulate. We can tell our children, don't lie. But then when the phone rings, and maybe it's grandma calling, and it's your mother-in-law, and the child answers the phone, and you say, tell her I'm not here. Tell her I'm in the shower, right? And in that moment, our child is taking in those cues, is taking in those stimuli, and is going to respond to what they see, not to what they hear. So we can tell them, don't lie until we're blue in the face. We can tell them, emulate the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam over and over and over again. But the real question is, what are we doing? What are we showing our children? Because that is what they will emulate. That is where they will learn how to respond to the world around them, particularly in that first stage of Tarbiyyah. And that's why that first stage of Tarbiyyah is so critical in terms of our interactions with our children, but also our interactions with our spouse, our interactions with our community, our interactions with those around us, because they are sponges. And in that stage, we are their role models. So if in that age, for example, we have a child, maybe we have a male and a female, and we tell our sons, don't cry, don't be a baby, what are you? Why are you acting like a girl? Right? These are things that we might say to our own children. And then we see in those teenage years, we see in the young adult years, children who are struggling. Again, gender, and I keep bringing this up because it is a phenomenon in our communities, and I don't know how aware we are of it, but we have a lot of youth struggling right now with the LGBTQ push and a great deal with gender nonconformity or gender non-binary or transgender approaches. We need to talk about this because it starts at that young age. It starts with our responses to our children and the atmosphere that we develop for them. So being very conscious of how we respond, being conscious of how we guide our children, implementing with our children a sense of self-esteem and confidence, which is very different than arrogance, right? We know that anyone who has a mustard seed weight of arrogance in their heart will not enter Jannah. But arrogance is not equivalent to self-confidence and self-esteem. Self-confidence and self-esteem in our children grows when they have a strong sense of security, particularly in the home. And that strong sense of security often comes from the way that we show our children love. If you've never read a little book called The 5 Languages of Love by Gary Chapman, I highly, highly recommend it. there's several versions of it. There's the 5 languages of love for romantic relationships, there's 5 languages of love for parenting, but the original 5 languages of love is my favorite, and I highly recommend it. Now in that book, the author goes through some basic concepts that we probably know and are familiar with, but we sometimes don't recognize in action. The premise of the book is that we often love those around us in the way that we want to be loved rather than in the way that they need to be loved. So the 5 languages are the language of affirmation, the language of service, the language of gifting, the language of touch, and the language of time. I can't tell you how many times we have had families come into our office where the child may say something like, I don't feel like my parents love me. And when we ask why, the child will say, they never say, I love you. They never say, good job. If I get, an A- on the test, they tell me, why didn't you get an A+? It's always criticism. And then when we bring the parents in and we say, your child doesn't feel loved by you, we'll often hear from the dad saying something like, I just bought him, a $500 pair of Yeezys. How can he say I don't love him? Right? And the mother might say something like, I cook him dinner, and I take him to soccer practice, and I do ABC. How can he say I don't love him? He's so ungrateful. And what we're seeing here is the child is speaking the language of affirmation. The child wants to hear the words, I love you. The child wants to feel a sense of connection with the parents that is verbalized. The mother is speaking the language of service. I do so much for you. How many of us have ever said this to our children? We don't have to respond, but just internal check. How many of us have heard this from our own parents? I do so much for you. This is the language of service, but that may not be the language your child is seeking. And the father, buying the Yeezys, purchasing the game for the Xbox, even, paying the mortgage and paying for the bills. This is the language of gifting, because these are things that are gifted. And so here there are 3 different languages being spoken, but the child in this case is seeking out one language that he's not receiving. And so he doesn't feel loved. What we see currently with today's generation of young adults, teens and tweens, the most prevalent language of love is the language of affirmation. And this is also part and parcel of living in an individualistic community, such as the US, right, which is very different than collectivist communities, which many of us maybe back home come from, or our parents come from. In an individualistic community, the language of affirmation tends to be the one that's most frequently spoken. And this is why when they go online or on social media, and again, they post a picture on Instagram and they get the flame and the hearts and like fire and sizzle, right? This is the language of affirmation that they may be seeking. If we are not giving them fire and hearts and sizzle, and you're lit or whatever the language is, at home, they are going to seek it elsewhere. So ensuring that we first of all understand our language, our love language, because we need to know what is it that we express. We tend to express our love in the way that we like to be loved. So ask yourself, what is it that makes you feel loved? Is it affirmation? Is it touch? Is it time? Is it service? Is it gifting? And ask yourself, if this is the way you're loving your children, then maybe there needs to be a little tweaking, recognizing what it is that your children need. Again, even with time, so often we think to ourselves like, okay, I gave my child time. I sat with my child and I did homework with them for an hour, right? That may not be the time that they're seeking, but sitting with them and playing Monopoly may be the time. Sitting with them and playing Fortnite if they're into Fortnite. Sitting with them and scrolling through TikTok if they're on TikTok. This may be the time that they are seeking, not the time that you're giving, where you may say, we all have to sit down as a family and have dinner together. As important as that collectivist concept is, many times it's lost on our youth who are more aligned with an individualistic perspective. And so even though you may be trying your hardest to get everyone to sit at the dinner table together, you have to ask yourself, is this speaking the language of my children? Is this what they need in this moment? And subhanAllah, when we look to the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jalla tells us in the Quran in Surah Al-Rum, we most often quote verse 21 in Surah Al-Rum, which is the marriage verse, where we're reminded to have mawadda wa rahmah in our interactions and our relationships so that we can find that sukoon, that tranquility in the marriage. But if we look to the verse before, verse 20 in Surah Al-Rum, and continue down to about verse 24, we actually see an entire formula for positive communication within the family paradigm. And it's a formula that applies to our children as well. Because at the end of each of those verses, Allah reminds us that in this relationship, in this connection, there is an ayah, a miracle from Allah. And this ayah will be noticed or understood by those who think, by those who rationalize, by those who have knowledge, by those who listen. And subhanAllah, when we look at these verses, we see that in verse 20 in Surah Al-Rum, Allah first tells us that He has created us as human beings who have dispersed, that we are all different, that we are different and from different parts of the earth. We are different from our children. Ali radiallahu anhu said, do not raise your children as you are raised, for each generation will have different problems than the generation before. Then we see that in this series of verses, we see that Allah describes also these differences by reminding us that there is ikhtilaf al-walakum, that there is a difference in our colors, ikhtilaf al-sinatakum, and there is a difference in our tongues. And oftentimes you see that word al-sinatakum translated in English as languages, but lisan actually means tongue. And so what it reminds us of is that our children may speak English, and we may speak English, same language, but the way that we speak it and the phenomenon of the connotated meanings of the words differ. And I often use this example. When I was growing up, it was the 80s, so Michael Jackson was big. But I remember there was a song that came out that was called Bad. And so the word bad became cool. So my sisters and I would walk around, and everything we liked would be like, oh, that's so bad. Oh, that's bad. And my parents would get so upset, and they'd say, you know what? If it's good, call it good. Why do you call it bad? If it's bad, call it bad. And this is a difference in tongues, right? We were speaking the same language, but there was something interior that belonged to us in that generation as youth in the 80s that really resonated with us. And it was a bridge that we didn't necessarily cross with our parents. Today, with our children, when we look at just the onslaught of the online world and what they are accessing, we realize that there is a completely different tongue being spoken. And it's a tongue that's spoken in, short phrases. And I remember, LOL was big for a while, and now, everybody knows what LOL is, but there's a whole bunch of other words that come up all the time. And I'm still saying like on fleek, even though apparently that's not cool anymore. But the idea of cool language and cool words keeps changing. I remember again when my daughter was around kindergarten age, she was always walking around saying OMA. And I had finally figured out what OMG was, and I didn't know what OMA was. So I had gone online and I was like, so urbandictionary.com is very useful, okay? You want to be careful because some of the words have very risque meanings, but sometimes it's helpful, especially if you're around teenagers, high schoolers, to kind of reference it. So I remember going to urbandictionary.com, typing in OMA, and nothing was coming up. And then finally I was like, I have to ask her. So I sat her down, I'm like, Layla, what is OMA? And she's like, Mama, it's oh my Allah. Everybody says it. And of course she was in Islamic school, so instead of OMG, everybody was saying OMA. So this idea of being able to understand the tongue of our children, we shouldn't necessarily try to speak it, because then it becomes really not cool really fast, right? But we should understand it. Because when our children are texting each other messages, and maybe, we're having a conversation with our kids, and we're like, hey, what is it that you guys were talking about? And they might say the weather, but if we know that the weather is, it's a pseudonym for something else, we want to be able to have those healthy conversations. Many of the conversations that children have today, for example, has to do with sexuality. We're kind of moving into that second stage of Tarbiyyah now. But, topics like children, and especially among the Muslim community, so many of our Muslim youth are coming out as pansexual. So many of them are coming out as demisexual. So many of them are coming out as, just a whole slew. Omnisexual is another new one that we're seeing quite a bit. Right? For many of us as parents, these terms that are linked to sexuality may be very strange to us. We may not be familiar to them. But the reality is that something like, or asexual, for example, a lot of Muslim youth will come out on the ace spectrum, right? And they'll call themselves, they'll say, I'm on the ace spectrum. As parents, we want to better understand what does that mean. Not because being on the ace spectrum is inherently, un-Islamic, because a child or a teenager that identifies as asexual simply means that they are not pulled towards being intimate, essentially, with someone. From an Islamic concept, it sounds good, right? Or demisexual, where you're not going to be intimate with someone unless there are intense feelings. But where we fall into trouble is that our youth today are now identifying more with sexual orientation than with faith. And this is the push of secularism, that if we can get our child to, or get our children to identify more with sexual orientation, or to identify more with a reversal of gender expectations or gender roles, we pull them further and further away from faith. And so a child who identifies as being on the ace spectrum, the conversation that needs to be had is why is sexual orientation and identity that has developed importance to the child, right? But we can't have that conversation if we don't understand the implicit meaning behind the push towards sexual orientation identification among our youth. And it is a push, because 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have heard all of these aspects. If your children are of college age and they're filling out college applications now, you know that there's about, I believe there's like 19 different genders that they can choose from now, right? It's not just male or female anymore. And not only are they asked to choose their gender, they're also asked, of course, their sexual orientation, which we're seeing, again, you can find online, there's a whole website for the different sexual orientations, but it's like 4 pages long on the college application now for sexual orientation. Not just that, our children in high schools, our children in middle schools, our children in colleges, and even us in the workplace are consistently being asked to identify our pronouns, right? What does this mean to a child who has never had a conversation with a parent when they enter into middle school or they enter into high school and they are asked, please identify your pronouns, right? Their natural reaction might be, she, right? He, right? But very quickly they're going to see from their classmates that there's a they, there is a them, there is a non-binary, there's ZHE instead of SHE, for example, just so many different iterations. So we want to understand this tongue, because this is the tongue that our children are speaking, and we want to better educate ourselves on what is happening. Why did we move from LGBTQ to LGBTQIA+? And the reality is that the Q, which used to stand for queer, now stands for questioning. How many of our youth who are at the age 13, 14, 15 may be questioning, right? Questioning because they're going through hormonal changes, they're not comfortable with their bodies, they're not sure what these feelings are that they're feeling. Maybe they've never had these conversations with their parents. So when they start to question, they have a whole community of rainbows and flags and unicorns welcoming women in and saying, if you're questioning, then you are part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And when on the other side of the scale, they see the masjid, they see their home, where the word gay cannot be said because it's haram, right? Topics of sexuality are not discussed, right? Questions about gender don't come up. Then what they see is that what's on the other side is giving them that affirmation, is speaking a tongue that they understand, is welcoming them. And so many of our youth who go through this natural questioning time during those middle school years will quickly begin to identify as part of the orientations under the LGBTQIA+ umbrella, because they are pulled towards that, because it seems so welcoming and enticing. And this is where faith identity is so important, because as we journey into that next stage of Tarbiyyah, I just want to be cognizant of the time, as we journey into that next stage of Tarbiyyah, right, from age 8 to 14, this is the age of discipline, we said, right? If in those early stages, age 0 to 7, we have cemented security, we have cemented love, we have given our children a sense of confidence in terms of who they are, their self-esteem and their identity, as they enter into this next stage, and we know it's the age in which we are no longer their first role models. Their role models become, Beyonce and Kanye West and whoever else is popular these days, right? And they look to their friends, they look to the social atmosphere, they look to the influencers online, they look to who's big on TikTok and who's big on YouTube, and those become the role models. As they journey into that stage, if we've cemented for them that love and security in the home in the early stages, then the anchor is still there. So that as they navigate their identities, they are able to navigate it, doing so knowing the anchor is there, knowing that the source of information, when they are questioning, will be the parents, not the friends, not the internet, because we've opened that dialogue with them. It's also so important that in those early stages, in preparing for the next stage of Tarbiyyah, we begin to implement the ability to instill in our children critical thinking. What does it mean to have those critical thinking skills? So many times in those young years, we tell our kids, go pray. Did you pray? Pray, right? Go make wudu. I think your elbows are not wet enough. Make sure you make wudu again, right? And we give them these commands, memorize the Quran. You must memorize. You have, Sunday school tomorrow. You have Saturday school tomorrow. You have to memorize. Don't embarrass me in front of the sheikh. And that's a whole other story when we tell our children not to embarrass us or what people are going to say. But we focus a lot on rote memorization in those young years. And we don't necessarily give our children the tools to understand what it means to critically think. Critical thinking involves the ability to dissect and recognize information, and they do so at a young age. So when we tell our children, this is how you pray, rather than just telling them, raise your arms up and say, Allahu Akbar, sitting with them and saying, when you raise your arms up and say, Allahu Akbar, you are saying that Allah is greater than everything difficult, everything bad, everything that you've gone through that was hard. You're putting it behind you as you're raising your arms up and praising Allah. And you're entering into a conversation with Allah. Being able to guide our children through the understanding of the principles and the rituals of our deen at that young age with information that is age appropriate. So for the child who's age 7, and you tell them, raise your hands up and say Allah, but ask them, what is it that may have bothered you today? That when you enter into salah, you want to push behind you. And maybe it's going to be something like, well, my little sister, took my paper and ripped it. And that's okay, tell them, well, then you won't. When you enter into salah, put that behind you and enter into the conversation with Allah. Because when they are at age 15, 16, 17, and the difficulties that they're facing are more intense emotionally, you want them to remember that moment when that paper that the little sibling ripped was put behind them as they entered into salah. Guiding them through an understanding of the verses of the Quran. So not just telling them, memorize Surah Al-Asr, it's only 3 short ayahs, it's easy to memorize it, but guiding them and letting them understand, why is Allah Azza wa Jal swearing by time? Why is it likely as the child gets older that when they are in a rush, they are probably going to pray with Surah Al-Asr? And how it is a reminder that Allah Azza wa Jal is giving to us that He knows, even in those moments where we may be rushing through our salah, that He will give us a reminder. We're going to pray with Surah Al-Ikhlas as a reminder of our taqwa. We're going to pray with Surah Al-Asr. So these are explanations that our children need in that early stage. Because when they enter that next stage, and they are sitting in their middle school history class, or they're sitting in their college philosophy class, and the professor tells them, prove to me the existence of God. Our children will not question, they will not waver, because they've already been taught the skills to critically think. Unfortunately, we are losing so many of our youth in those college years who are heading towards atheism and agnosticism. And so many times when you sit with these youth who are denouncing Islam, and you ask them why, their response is like, well, rationally it doesn't make sense. And so many times we focus on the faith part, on the iman, without realizing that our children are going to face a world here in the US that is going to constantly ask them to rationalize. And our deen, subhanAllah, it is so beautiful in that everything does have a rationale. We just have to take the time to explain it to our children, to guide them through it at every step of the way. So that they're not suddenly feeling like, now my voice is heard when my professor asks me, to explain why God exists. Now my opinion is heard. We want our children's opinion to be heard every step of the way. So now we're in that stage, the stage of 8 to 14. celebration of the home, of, Jannah's cute little age, mashallah, where they get the awe and everybody, coddles them, into a stage where they're starting to be expected to have adult-like qualities. But they're not adults. They're still children, and they're still learning. It's also the age, again, where they turn away from parents, and it's not quite as cool to go to places with mom and dad as it might have been when they were younger. And it's the age of exploration. It is also the age when I tend to see parents most often introducing devices, whether it is the cell phone or the iPad or the iPod, but this is the age where we tend to see the most prevalence of devices. And this is dangerous, right? We often say, like 20 years ago, if you had given a child a stack of Playboy magazines and said to the child, I trust you, I know you're only going to look at the pictures, and said, go ahead, take them in your room, you're not going to look at the pictures, you're only going to read the articles. Go ahead, take them in your room, I know you're only going to read the articles. We would have said these parents are terrible, that they shouldn't allow access to a child to something that's clearly going to pull them into the path of haram. But today we give our children the devices, we give them the cell phone, the iPad, all sorts of devices. And we have conversations with them often. And maybe sometimes those conversations look like, you'd better not go on any bad sites or I'm going to take the phone away from you, right? A lot of times they go along those paths. Rather than sitting with the children, guiding them, understanding what's out there, right? If your child is on TikTok, you need to be on TikTok. If your child is on Instagram, you need to be on Instagram. If your child is on Instagram, know that they probably have a Finsta account, which is the fake Instagram that they post things that you're not going to see on their regular Instagram. We need to know these things. We need to know that there are so many apps that come up with the image of a calculator. So if you're looking at your child's phone and there's 2 calculators there, you might want to question why, because often the second calculator hides the app that maybe you told them you didn't want them to get, or the app that they know they shouldn't have. So really educating ourselves and developing greater literacy in terms of what's on here. And not necessarily laying this blanket trust where you're handing the device and saying, go ahead. Finding that balance. And also applying the rules for the devices for your children to yourselves as well. So for example, I know, for us in our household, we have, 10 p.m. is disconnect time. And it's been like that, for a very long time, where everyone in the household by 10 p.m. has to unplug or has to, take the phone, the laptop, any device, and it has to be put into a central charging station that we have in the kitchen. And after 10 p.m., nothing can be done. And this it applies to me, my husband, as well as our adult kids and our high schooler. But if we were to apply that rule only to the children, and we're not doing it, then clearly, again, we're sending mixed signals. If our children, or if myself and my husband have work that needs to be done, we know that the household rule is you wake up for tahajjud and you get the work done between Salat al-Tahajjud and Salat al-Fajr. And subhanAllah, I tell you this even as an adult, there is so much barakah in that time. The grant report or the emails that need to be responded to or the book chapter that needs to be written is done so much faster during that time from Tahajjud to Fajr than if I were to stay up, until midnight or 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. So start implementing healthy avenues for yourself with your devices that you want your children to emulate. Have the conversations with your children, right? Parents often ask me, should I take my child's phone and check what they did online? If you have a relationship with your child where they feel comfortable coming to you, knowing that you're not going to lose it on them, knowing that you're not going to flip out, then there is no need to be checking, because they will come to you and say, I got this weird DM, or somebody airdropped a picture and it wasn't a picture that was appropriate, or I like this kid and I'm thinking of sending him a message on Snapchat, right? They will come to you and have these conversations. And we see it in the example of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. When the young man of the Ummah came to him, when he was sitting with the Sahaba, and he said, I want to fornicate, I want to commit adultery, I want to commit zina. And the Sahaba sitting next to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam were really surprised. How could he come to the blessed, beloved messenger of Allah and say this? And so they were about to stand up and respond negatively, and yet the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam went like this. And he told them to wait. And he answered the young man using critical thinking strategies. He answered the young man by relating it back to something that was important to him. He asked him, is this something that you would want someone to do to your mother? He said, no. He said, is this something you would want someone to do to your sister? He said, no. Is this something you would want someone to do to your future daughter? He said, no. Is this something you would want someone to do to your future wife? He said, no. And then Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, well, the person that you would do this with is somebody's daughter, could be somebody's sister, may someday be somebody's mother. And the young man understood. He understood because it wasn't a response of haram, haram, haram. It was a critical thinking lens. And then the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam placed his hand on the heart of the child and made or the youth and made sincere dua that Allah Azza wa Jalla would remove this desire from his heart. How many times have our kids come to us, especially in those middle school years, when they're still asking us for permission and they still want to tell us something, and our response to them is, Astaghfirullah, what have I done to deserve this? Or a response is like, yay, what are people going to say, right? And we give such a negative response that causes our children to slink back and not want to share with us. So that first response is so important. Just like we know Islamically, we are told that when we are faced with tragedy, the first response of responding with Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un in that moment is the most critical response. The same goes for our children. How we respond in the moment. Our children will mess up. Our children will make mistakes. We as human beings consistently make mistakes. And we know that Allah is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. And this is one of the most important messages that we need to implement for our children, that the rahmah of Allah is greater than any sin they may commit, that the repentance and the door of repentance is always open to them. So that when a child makes a mistake, they are not steeped in mire, in shame from that mistake, that they continue on that path of making mistakes because they can't come to us, because they can't speak to us about it. And if in that stage, again from 8 to 14, when we as parents are no longer maybe the source of information, the source of trust, it is our job as parents to ensure that our children are surrounded by mentors, surrounded by teachers, surrounded by companions that are beneficial to them. This aspect of companionship is so important because we have lost the sense of companionship, particularly among our youth today. At the time of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know the important role that the Sahaba played in his life in terms of being there, supporting, and having a sense of brotherhood and a connection of love. In today's society, our children are taught that if they have deeply emotional feelings towards someone of the same gender, that those feelings must be sexual in nature. And this is why so many of our youth who don't understand the sense of companionship, who haven't experienced what it means to have a platonic relationship of companionship where they admire and love someone, love them for the sake of Allah, love them for what they bring to the table, that it is not necessarily sexual in terms of what it's linked to, in terms of the relationship. And so bringing back that sense of companionship is so important because so many young people will question their sexual orientation because they are slammed with it consistently. Every video you open online, every commercial now, every movie, every song, every book, we are seeing this push to essentially sexualize our children's relationships from a young age. And so when they develop feelings of admiration, feelings of connection, they are unable to label that as companionship, and instead they are pushed towards that individualistic secular view that this must be something more, that I must be, somewhere on the spectrum of the LGBTQIA+ agenda. So teach your children about companionship. Teach them about companionship by emulating that sense of companionship. Emulate that sense of companionship in your community, among your friends, loving someone for the sake of Allah, and guiding them towards an understanding of that as well. And knowing who are they interacting with. Particularly post-COVID, we've seen a rise in terms of friendships that are based online, right? Young people who connect with others, whether it's through the games that they play, the video games that they play, whether it's on Discord, whether it's on Vent, whether it's on any of those social media apps that are meant to connect. where they will identify their closest friends as being people that they've never met, people that are online. We also know the prevalence of catfishing, right? It just takes a quick, anyone that has Snapchat and goes through the filters, it just takes a quick push of a button to make a female look like a male, to make a male look like a female, to change the appearance of someone. And we know that our children are particularly susceptible to this form of catfishing online. So again, we want to be aware, we want to recognize and understand what's out there, and we want to develop avenues of openness with our children so that they can come talk to us about this openly, without fear. And another avenue, that is kind of important to emulate is that with our own spouses, within our own families, not necessarily having a code on our phone, not necessarily entering a room and putting our phone face down because we don't want someone to see our text. Because remember, our children will imitate that and they'll emulate that. So providing discipline in that stage, again, knowing how to discipline from a place of love, not from a place of fear or anger. In a moment when our children do make a mistake, right, we want to stop and ask ourselves, am I going to respond in this moment rationally? Am I going to respond in a way that's most pleasing to Allah and that's going to impact my child positively, or am I going to respond out of a place of emotion or anger? Most of the time, we need a few minutes to gather our thoughts, to know how to respond, especially if it's a mistake that's really something you didn't expect, maybe something you didn't think would happen, right? For example, I know I often get parents that come into our office and they'll be very, very upset because maybe they found weed in their child's backpack, maybe they found spice or K2, maybe they found a condom, maybe they found something that was written, maybe they found something online. That's like a whole other place that they find. And so many times the first response of the parents is to lose it on the children. Screaming, shouting, even in many cases physically harming the child. And again, I keep saying child because even at age 13, 14, in that stage, they are still children and they're still learning. And so even when they do make a mistake, giving that space to be able to process what the problem is and to think about how you're going to respond. Give yourself a timeout. Take 5 minutes where you step away before you act in a way that could have honestly irrevocable results. If you harm the child in that moment, you will lose their trust, you will lose that connection, and then in many ways you've lost the child. So giving yourself a timeout, gathering your thoughts, letting the child know, look, I am upset about something, I need to process it, and then we're going to talk about it. And that will go a much longer way than if you react in the moment. I want to move into the next stage, since I also want to make sure we have time for Q&A before Sultan goes. But as we head into the next stage, right, this is the stage of 15 to 21. This is the age of advisement, right? It's the age where our children now have hopefully gotten a sense of security in the early years, have received a sense of discipline from a place of love, not a place of fear, not a place of anger, and now are ready to apply their critical thinking strategies in those moments. Now, if we move back a little bit, just as we're segueing into this last stage, and we think about in those years of discipline, those are the years where your child may come to you and say, I want to sleep over. And your response might just be like, no, you can't sleep over. Remember critical thinking. Just no, can't sleep over. The child's response is most likely going to be, but why? But why? Everybody else sleeps over. So-and-so, my friends, back in the day when there weren't as many Islamic schools, a lot of times parents would just say, because we're Muslim, that's why, right? Now we know as our communities have grown, mashallah, there's going to be different parenting strategies and different approaches within different families. And there may be a family that allows the sleepover and a family that doesn't, right? Giving the child an explanation, and not an explanation of, because I said so, right? But giving them an explanation and age appropriate. So being able to tell them that, sometimes at sleepovers, things happen that you really can't change, whether it's because, you're together alone at night, whether it's because the parents aren't there, maybe I'm not comfortable with the parent. But along with that discipline, offer an alternative. Because if the answer is just no, 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 then our children grow up thinking there is more haram than there is halal in our deen. When we know that's not true, that there is so much more halal in our deen than there is haram. Give them the alternative. If that message and now are doing an amazing job of offering these alternatives. If the sleepover is not something you're comfortable with, maybe in Ramadan, take them to an i'tikaf in the masjid where you will be there with them. Provide the alternatives in terms of that discipline, so that when they get to that next stage, the 15 to 21, they are ready to respond themselves. So that when that cute guy in math class asks them out, and says, hey, I don't even know if they do the dating this way anymore. I think now they say, give me your Snapchat handle or something, right? That in that moment, they're able to think about the conversations that you've had, the discussions you've shared, the understanding of what it means, that these are conversations you've had before they've gotten to high school, before they've reached this last stage of Tarbiyyah. That why is it that Allah Azza wa Jal has commanded us not to go near zina, not just to not commit it, but not to go near it, and giving them that understanding from a young age. I know it's really hard in our households to talk about, the three-letter word, to talk about sex. But if we know that our children are talking about this, hearing this word consistently over and over again, we have to be the source of information. We have to be comfortable using that tongue in a way where we maintain our hayat and we guide our children towards a sense of hayat, because they will be bombarded with this. There are two great books that I often recommend for parents, for children that are just at the start of the second stage of Tarbiyyah. One of it is called A Muslim Boy's Guide to Life's Big Changes, and the other one is A Muslim Girl's Guide to Life's Big Changes. Right around the age of age 8 or 9, right there, I would say have your children read both books. Have the son read the male and the female book, have the daughter read the male and the female book. But don't have them read it alone. Don't just give them the book and be like, here, read this, right? Make it part of that 5-minute time. Maybe every night you read a chapter together. And they're very small books, right? They are conversation starters. They don't necessarily cover in depth, all of the changes that their bodies are going to go through, but they open the conversation to let your children know it is okay to talk to me about these topics. I am here to answer your questions. Start with those books at that young age, because when they get older and they're in those high school ages and they are given books to read, even part of the literature curriculum, and we are seeing now a push for the English high school language curriculums where the books, many of the protagonists are struggling with their sexuality, are coming out as part of LGBTQ. If you are setting the foundation in that younger age that we can read these things together, we can understand them together, as they get older, they're going to have that cemented in their mind. So how do you go through the age of advisement, right? This is the age where maybe your 17-year-old is going to come home and say, I want to go to prom, right? If you utilize the same response of the age of discipline, no, right? That is the stage where the child usually has a sense of rebellion, because at 15, 16, 17, they feel like they're adults, right? I mean, in your eyes, of course, they're still children, but they're feeling like they're full-fledged adults. So rather than responding with no at that moment, think about those years of developing critical thinking. And in that moment, you might want to start with a question. Well, why do you want to go to prom, right? And keeping your face very neutral, not astaghfirullah, why would you want to go to prom, right? Keeping it very neutral, letting the teen kind of come to the conclusion themselves. So saying, why would you want to go to prom? And maybe the response is like, well, all my friends are going, and it's the last thing we're going to do, and it's senior year, and it's so much fun, right? And then maybe sitting with the child and saying, okay, what could possibly go wrong at prom? Why do you think it might not be a good idea to go to prom? And I always tell parents, if you've got teenagers in that last stage, learn how to do a SWOT analysis. Teach them how to figure out the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and threats in every decision that they make. Guide them towards praying istikhara. Even if a child says, I want to go to this event, right? Ask them, tell them, well, do you think it might be a good idea to pray istikhara and see how you feel? And you may be thinking, what? How could I pray istikhara about going to prom? But if we guide our children towards an understanding that every decision that should be made is a decision that should be made with keeping Allah Azza wa Jal first and foremost in your mind, then they're going to make that association. And then, they'll stop and ask themselves, wait, does it make sense to pray istikhara about prom? If I know that at prom there's going to be things that are happening that are not Islamic, then should I even go down that path? So normalizing this connection with Allah so that when they are in the age of advisement, are advising, not disciplining. You are not putting that boundary and just saying yes or no, but you're guiding them towards those right responses. Because before you know it, they will be in college. And college, we see college as being kind of the grassroots of liberalism and with a push towards intense secularism, where there is a real push away from faith-based perspectives and a push towards more of this, be you, do you, if it feels good, it must be good, right? And this is an approach that we see, again, it's developed in our children from a young age, particularly throughout society. This is the whole idea of, responding to your desires. When we look at the gender-bread curriculum that was introduced in New Jersey about 2 years ago, we see that the gender-bread curriculum in kindergarten, it begins, where children are guided towards, there's these posters of what would look like a gingerbread man on the walls in the kindergarten classroom, and children are asked to identify how they feel. And they're told, do you feel like a female or do you feel like a male? Do you feel like you are being attracted to this side or that side? And this is at age 5. And the idea is to push away from, to push towards the gender nonconformity, right? And the gender non-binary approach, where you can have biological attributes that would align with a male, but you don't have to be a male if you don't feel like a male. And so it's the age of feeling, right? If it feels this way, it should be that way. And this is why, in those early stages, we really want to guide our children towards an understanding of the nafs. Because we know that Allah Azza wa Jalla in the Quran tells us, that we should not ittaba' al-hawa, right? Al-hawa is like the wind, our giving in to whims and desires. So when we look to the understanding of the nafs and how we can guide our children towards the age of advisement by recognizing when the nafs may be overcoming them and how to control the nafs, we guide them through the 3 elements of the nafs al-ammara, the nafs al-lawama, and the nafs al-mutma'inna. And so from a young age, again in that first stage, and we should kind of redesign the analogy and the examples that we use as they move older. But in that age from 0 to 7, if we explain to them the concepts of the nafs by saying, for instance, if there was chocolate cake in front of me, my nafs al-ammara might tell me, eat the chocolate cake. It looks so good, eat the whole thing. But my nafs al-lawama might remind me, if you eat the whole cake, you're going to get a stomach ache. You're not going to feel that good. But it looks so good. Maybe I'll just take a bite. Maybe I'll just take a slice. And that's the nafs al-lawama. But if we do give in and take a bite and take a slice, we may want more and more, right? And then kind of connecting it to al-hakum al-takathur as we're teaching our children the Quran. In order to reach that nafs al-mutma'inna, the contented self, we want our children to be able to see that chocolate cake and to say, you know what? It's a chocolate cake. It looks like a good chocolate cake, but alhamdulillah, I know that if I eat too much of this cake, I'm going to get a stomach ache. I know that this chocolate cake is not going to be helpful for me, down the road. So I'm not going to eat the chocolate cake, and alhamdulillah, I'm content with not eating the chocolate cake. Or whatever kind of analogy works for your children in that early stage, age 0 to 7. So this way, when our children get to the second stage and the third stage, 8 to 14 and 15 to 21, in those stages, they're going to be able to clearly see the signs of when the nafs al-ammara is being drawn out and what they can do in terms of strengthening that nafs al-lawama in order to reach the nafs al-mutma'inna. So that when they feel a feeling, maybe they have a crush on that kid in math class, and maybe that kid in math class comes and says, hey, give me your Snapchat, right? And in that moment, their nafs al-ammara might say, oh, he's so cute, I really want to, friend him on Snapchat, I want to follow him, or whatever it is, right? Their nafs al-lawama will, inshallah, hopefully kick in because of the conversations you've had together, where they might feel like, oh, but it's not a good idea to give him my Snapchat, because that's how it begins, right? It'll start with Snapchat, and who knows where it's going to end. And they might still feel a little bit upset about it. But hopefully that is the point where they will come to you and say, the cute kid in math class asked for my Snapchat today, right? And you will not flip out, and you will not say, astaghfirullah, you're homeschooled from now on, right? You'll be able to have the conversation with them, where you tell them, okay, how can you get to the nafs al-mutma'inna? How can you did the right thing by not giving the Snapchat, but how can you be content with it? And guiding our children to a better understanding of what it means to reach the nafs al-mutma'innah. What Allah Azza wa Jalla means in Surah Al-Fajr when He says that He will call to the nafs al-mutma'innah and invite that nafs into Jannah, because He will be contented with that nafs that is contented with Him. So many of our children don't make that connection. So many of our children just think, I'm not going to take the Snapchat because my parents would kill me if I did. And that's just enough to make them get really good at hiding things. That's just enough to keep them from, showing things out in public. We want to be able to guide our children to a place where they can make the intellectual leap as well as that faith-based leap that's going to, bi'idhnillah, protect them and guide them and keep them on the straight path, inshallah. So we've got, it's almost 12:30, so I'll kind of wrap things up here and then we'll open it up to questions. I don't know if there are like note cards for questions, or we could just have, we're a small enough group that we can just have people stand and ask their questions. But just a few more points and then I'll wrap up and we'll go to Q&A. So another issue that we often see in that last stage of Tarbiyyah from 15 to 21 is not just, issues with same gender. Again, 10 years ago when I would give this workshop, I didn't really talk a lot about, same gender attraction, because we spent a lot of time talking about opposite gender attraction. But now we're seeing both, and both are an issue, right? It's the age where children are looking around and they're seeing their friends dating, their friends in relationships, whether it's online or in person. They're seeing a lot that's going on in terms of, the romantic inclinations. And so many times our children are struggling with their own issues of self-esteem, issues of self-confidence. They're seeking that affirmation and that approbation elsewhere, not because they didn't get it within the home. We also see this stage as being the stage in which a rise in mental health issues tend to appear. We know during COVID in particular, we saw just an incredible rise in the amount of diagnosed, so clinical cases of depression and anxiety among youth. And it's continued. It's not like post-COVID or post-pandemic that we've seen a drop. But we do see among youth right now, and particularly in the Muslim community, we do see very large numbers of those who are clinically diagnosed with depression, clinically diagnosed with anxiety. We're also seeing an increase in terms of BPD, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. And there is a reason for that. First of all, understanding from a mental health perspective that mental health is real, and it is an illness, right? Mental health issues, mental health struggles, it is real and it is an illness. But there are two different avenues. There is situational depression, situational anxiety, and there is clinical or chronic depression and anxiety. Situational tends to be tied to a specific situation. So during COVID, during the online schooling, we saw a lot of issues of situational anxiety or situational depression, right? We've also seen situational paranoia, we've seen situational OCD, particularly in the form of scrupulosity, which we'll talk about in a minute. But many of the situational aspects were diagnosed as clinical or chronic. And it's because we live in a society that is so medically focused that a lot of times it's, you've got a problem, take a pill. And we know that that's not what our deen advocates for, that we advocate for more of a holistic approach, that our mental health is linked to our spiritual health, it's linked to our physical health, it's linked to our emotional health, it's linked to our relational health, it's linked to our social health, and we can't just take one corner of the problem, give it a pill, and say that's it, you're fixed. So being able to take a step back and first of all educating ourselves on mental health and how we see mental health struggles kind of manifesting within youth in particular, because it is usually in that last stage, 15 to 21, that we tend to see the greatest increase in terms of mental health outcomes for youth. They may have shown certain symptoms or instances at younger ages, but we do see a larger development at that age. Now, I'm sure many of you who have younger children who maybe are active in school or respond in hyperactive ways are told by schools, get your child checked out for ADD, get your child checked out for ADHD. And again, we do know that we live in a medicate society, which I in no way speak against medication. I do think there are very specific mental health issues and struggles that do need medication, but I also think taking a holistic approach is important. So being able to research and seek out avenues and better understand what is it that your child is showing in terms of symptoms. Recognizing, for example, what does clinical depression look like? What does clinical anxiety look like? How does a panic attack differ from an anxious episode? and we could probably have a 1-hour lecture just on mental health outcomes, but I just wanted to share briefly. First of all, don't ignore your child. If your child says, I feel depressed, ask why. Try to better understand what's going on. Don't just dismiss it. Don't say pray 2 rak'ahs or your iman is not strong enough. Right? Make sure that you are responding from a lens of understanding, and you're responding from a place of recognition that what your child is feeling is valid, it's important, and you hear them and you understand them. Don't dismiss and say alhamdulillah, you have a roof over your head and food on the table, what do you have to be depressed about? Right? And again, we have the beautiful example in the Quran of Maryam alayhi salam, when she went through the hardest moments in her life, when she was giving birth, when she was alone in labor, and she calls out to Allah and says, Ya laytani mittu qabla hadha wa kuntu nasiyan mansiyya. She says, oh, if only I had passed before this and had been of those who were forgotten. So when our children are struggling, and maybe they do say things like, I wish I wasn't here. Maybe you identify issues of suicide ideation. Maybe there is self-harm that is occurring in your child's life. Please do not ignore it. Please do not dismiss it as un-Islamic or a lack of faith. Because when we see in the Quran, when Maryam alayhi salam, who was a woman of faith, a woman who's promised Jannah, calls out in pain, emotional pain, not just physical pain, we see the verses that follow and we're reminded that نُودِيَ مِن تَحْتِهَا, a voice calls from beneath her and says, لَا تَحْزَنِي. The voice says, do not be sad. She's not rebuked. She's not turned away. She's comforted. And then she is told, his sijaz and nakhla, to shake the trunk of the palm tree so the fruit may fall from the palm tree. She's asked to do something. And then she's told to go back to her community but not to speak, to point at the infant rather than speaking. So many times with our teenagers in that last stage, 15 to 21, they may be struggling. And we may say something like, tell me what's going on. How can I help you if you don't tell me? Why are you crying? Tell me what's wrong. Why are you always upset? Why are you cranky? Rather than recognizing that sometimes if our children are struggling with any form of depression, whether chronic, clinical, or situational, that they can't talk. That they really don't know how to put into words what they're feeling. That there is a reason why they can't get up and shower. There is a reason why that they're under the pillows and just want to sleep. And that reason is not laziness. That reason is not necessarily giving up. Because we see that depression can influence our children and can affect them, whether it's hormonally, whether it's a chemical imbalance, whether it's situationally, that there's so many different elements can impact them. And I know last year there was a study that was released by Dr. from the Islamic Psychology Lab in Stanford that showed that Muslim youth between the ages of 18 and 21 are twice as likely to attempt suicide than non-Muslim youth. These are our statistics, these are our youth. And so many times in our communities when a young person passes away, all we hear is cardiac arrest, or he died in his sleep, or she died unexpectedly. So many times we don't hear the stories or know just how prevalent suicide is in our community. But it is there, and it is happening. And it's something that we want to be aware of. So again, start at a young age. Watch the movie Inside Out with your children. Talk to them about emotions and what they feel. Guide them through that second stage when their hormones are raging and they're going to feel all sorts of way. To recognize and understand that this is not a crisis of iman, that this is not because they are bad or have done something wrong. Get to that last stage of tarbiyyah while you're aware and understanding of the impact of anxiety, depression, BPD, OCD. I mentioned scrupulosity because that actually tends to be the most prominent OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, that we see among Muslim youth and Muslim adults in particular. And essentially what scrupulosity is, it's a ritualistic OCD, meaning, you may be entering into your prayer, and because you feel that, unclean, or you feel like you've done something that was not pleasing to Allah, you will repeat a verse of Quran over and over and over again. You'll be making wudu, and you feel like your wudu is not good enough. And sometimes it comes from a place of criticism in youth. Sometimes it comes from a feeling of not measuring up. And you will repeat the wudu over and over and over again for hours. And this is a mental health illness. So again, we don't want to mental health issues and the struggles do exist in our communities, and we do tend to see them most prevalently in those later years. So I'm going to wrap up here, but I do just want to say that first of all, as parents, I pray that Allah Azza wa Jalla allows us to be the best versions of ourselves for His sake and His sake alone, and in so doing, being the best versions for our children. And I pray that Allah Azza wa Jalla guides us through the tumultuous times of childhood and young adulthood and adolescence, so that we are able to be the advisors for our children, to be the guides for them. If we are running into trouble, if we are struggling in raising our children in any of those stages, do not be afraid of seeking counseling. Do not be afraid of looking for help, because Allah Azza wa Jalla puts us in specific places because sometimes we need to hear something that is relevant to us or relevant to our struggle. If any of you are struggling with mental health difficulties, if any of you are struggling with relationship difficulties, if any of you are struggling in the process of Tarbiyyah, get help. Because it starts with you as parents. And there are so many avenues of counseling now. I know I've got some information about our Cornerstone centers, and we have several physical locations, but we also do televisits. But there's so many counselors out there now that are taking more of a holistic approach and that do incorporate the Islamic perspective in terms of how they guide and treat clients and patients. So don't hesitate, seek help. And inshallah, may Allah Azza wa Jalla guide us all to the straight path, guide our children, protect them, and allow them to be of the mu'mineen who will be the coolness of our eyes.